how should we continue to read this Russia situation here? We want to bring in Doug Rediker. He's Brookings Institute non-resident scholar, senior fellow, foreign policy, global economy and development. Pardon me, Doug. Thanks so much for being here this morning. I want to start with, what is Putin trying to achieve? And then with that in mind, how can we try to extrapolate what he's going to do next?
What is Putin trying to achieve is the how many trillion-dollar question, because that's really what's at stake here. Nobody knows. So first of all, I would not want to be the guy who throws cold water on this morning's upside news about the withdrawal of some troops. But let's be clear, this is not the end. This is not suddenly a never mind, oh, just kidding kind of moment. There's a lot at stake here. There's a lot at work here. And what intelligence analysts will always tell you is, look at what Putin does, not what Putin says. So first of all, yes, good news that there's reports that the troops are being withdrawn, but it's some reports, some troops. There's also other reports that the Duma, that's the Russian parliament, has approved a non-binding resolution that recognizes the two breakaway republics in the Donbass, that area of enormous conflict and tension that's subject to the so-called Minsk II Accords. They want to recognize those as Russian territory. So that is a pretext for a completely different angle that the Putin government could have to play in Ukraine and in this broader saga. So the answer to the overall question, what does he want, remains very outstanding. And I'd break it into two buckets, basically. One is Ukraine specific, and the other is more broadly. What is NATO's role? What is the US's role as a security guarantor for Europe? What are those Central and Eastern European countries that broke away from the former Soviet Union in the early 1990s and joined NATO formally in 1997? What is their future? Because Putin put that all on the table, and that is still all very, very much in play and unresolved.
Doug, should Russia invade Ukraine, what do you think some of the responses by the United States would be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a part of this that we call proportionality, which is, you remember Joe Biden's famous press conference a couple of weeks ago, where he used the phrase minor incursion and distinguished that from a major invasion. And the problem that we all have is somewhere between a minor incursion and a major invasion are a lot of nuances of what the Russians can do. And those will all likely engender a different set of responses, both from the US and from the EU, either separately or in coordinated fashion. At the most extreme case, you're talking about sanctioning Russian banks to the point where they simply aren't allowed to do business in US dollars or with any other entity that does business in US dollars, which effectively means European banks and almost everyone else. There's some people that talk about oil sanctions and gas sanctions. I think that that's far-fetched. Even during the height of the Cold War, gas flowed from the Soviet Union into Europe. That, unless it is a warfare casualty, I don't think that the US is going to go out and sanction those transfers of gas into Europe. Nord Stream 2 is a separate issue. That is not fully functional. So while it has huge geopolitical impact, it doesn't really have any immediate economic impact. But there's also another area that the US has floated, which is to use something called the Foreign Direct Product Rule under the Export Control Act. It's a lot of gobbledygook, but basically what that means is the US could say any company in the world that exports any particular product, and in this case, we're talking about high-tech semiconductors, to go to Russia would be prohibited completely. That means that Russia would be cut off from all of the bones of the future development of artificial intelligence, and let's say all of the technology that's likely to power the 21st century economy. That's the first time the US has ever floated something like that. It doesn't actually require the EU to come along, something that's completely within the US competence. And that's a big deal that Putin didn't expect. So between financial sanctions, potential energy sanctions, and these technology-based sanctions, those are three big areas where Russia could be hit.
Well, let's flip that coin around. What actions could Russia take on the U.S., Doug? Because there are a lot of U.S. companies, of course, operating in Russia. You know, top of mind, I think McDonald's. I think a lot of the fast food companies. Could he shut those companies down?
Yeah, but I think the risks are far greater than that. I think one of the big problems we have here is we're getting into the area of the unimaginable. So if you're really in a warfare scenario with Russia, the ability for Russia to pull a trigger on some cyber attacks, not just against Ukraine or even Europe, but against the US, depending on how aggravated Putin gets, they could do some real nasty damage, because the expectation, now I don't know, you don't know, but the basic expectation is that we have the power to, for example, shut off Russia's utilities, and they have the power to do the same for us, simply because over the years, each side has enormous cyber attack capability that is sort of lying in wait. So if you think about the worst case scenario, which if you're in the US government, you're paid to do, you're probably warning utilities, private companies, banks, and other actors that they better bolster their cyber defenses to a level that they really hadn't anticipated before. Because it's more than just shutting down McDonald's or even, refusing to allow people to leave the country or to enter the country on a commercial basis. This could get much more widespread and much more dangerous if it reaches into the realm of cyber. And depending on what we do and what he does and what we do and what he does, it could escalate to that point. And that's got big consequences.
I mean, one would hope that this is like nuclear detente, right? Where because you know that the other side has the same capabilities that you do, nobody does anything. I guess that would be the hope, but I don't know how that would play out in reality. So given the scenario that you're painting here then, and given the potential for that, what do you make of the U.S. market's reaction that we've seen thus far, which in the past few days, we've seen more of a reaction. We've seen reactivity to various headlines.
Well, you use the key word there. The key word there is headlines. This is a story that has so many levels of complexity that headlines can't really grasp what's going on. But we all know investors, markets, traders focus on headlines. So when you hear a headline or you read a headline that says Putin sits down with Lavrov and talks diplomacy, that makes you feel that the risk of war is less than it was before you read that headline. Similarly, this morning, you had the headlines about the potential for removing some of the troops. That's a positive headline. So the markets are really reading the headlines and reacting to those. That's better than ignoring it altogether. But I would argue this is a very nuanced, very complicated story. The intelligence community in Washington, which has both the intelligence we know about and presumably a lot of intelligence that we don't know about, they themselves don't know what's going on to the level where they have a high degree of confidence. There was a story this morning that broke right after the story about the Russians saying they're going to withdraw some troops, with a report saying that the U.S. now has intelligence that the attack is going to start at 3 a.m. tomorrow. So how do you square those two? You have to almost sort of pick the headline and run with what the theme of the market is for that day, that hour, that moment. Because in fact, if you try to get under this, which I and some others do as a day job, it's really hard to figure out what's going on. And so if you were a market actor, you'd say, wow, this is too uncertain. Maybe I just pull my chips off the table. But that's not what I would recommend. And that's not what traders and investors do. So on the basis of having what limited information they have, they run with the headline of the day.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate your helpful context here in this situation, being mostly lay people when it comes to the situation there. Doug Rediker, thank you for your expertise this morning. Brookings, non-resident senior fellow of foreign policy, global economy and development. Appreciate it.